Every evening in Wisconsin, 1945, as the floodlights hummed on over Camp McCoy, Lieutenant Robert Ames began his slow walk along the inner perimeter. He did it the same way each night, same pace, same nod to the guards, same turn at the western watchtower. It wasn't written in any order. It wasn't part of a schedule anyone had assigned. Yet before long, that quiet routine became the clock by which hundreds of men, Americans and German prisoners alike, measured their days. That evening, the light was low enough for breath to show, the kind of thin dusk that made every movement look deliberate. The American guards were changing posts. A bugle sounded somewhere by the mess hall. Ames pulled on his gloves, touched the brim of his cap, and started the walk. He always began at the northern fence near the tool shed where the prisoners repaired farm equipment. A few POWs were still visible beyond the wire, folding blankets and wiping down benches before lights out. When they noticed him, some straightened, some kept working. Ames didn't wave or speak. He simply walked, steady, hands behind his back. Inside the camp, everyone knew about his walk. The guards at the towers checked their watches by it. The kitchen crew used it as their cue to start boiling water for the night shift's coffee. The prisoners called it the evening line. To them, it was not a show of power, but something else, an act that said things would stay orderly, that no surprise was coming tonight. Ames hadn't meant it to matter that much. When he'd first arrived months earlier, Camp McCoy had been restless. Rumors about escapes, arguments over rations, uneasy nights after news from Europe. He was young then, barely 30, new to the post. The first week he tried to run drills tighter, post guards closer, make his presence felt. It only raised the tension. Then one night, after a long shift, he started walking just to clear his head. The sound of his boots against gravel, the rhythm of it, the sight of lights flickering on in the barracks, it settled something in him. The next night, he did it again. Others noticed, and by the third week, his walk had become part of the camp. Later that spring, a German carpenter named Franz began to time his cleanup by the lieutenant's shadow crossing the fence line. "When the tall one passes," he told another prisoner, "it's time to put the tools away." Soon the entire workshop followed that rhythm. Without knowing it, Ames had turned an uneasy compound into a place that moved by one quiet pattern. There were small disruptions. One night, a new guard complained that the walk looked too soft, that it made the prisoners feel equal. Ames didn't argue. He just kept walking. Within days, the same guard stopped objecting, because the men on both sides of the fence were calmer when Ames walked. There were fewer reports, fewer accidents. When snow came, Ames still walked, coat buttoned to the neck, boots leaving twin lines in the white dust. Some POWs began to brush the snow from the inside of the fence before he reached their sector. No one had ordered them to do it. By mid-year, the camp command noted that McCoy had fewer disciplinary issues than any other POW facility in the region. They credited new rules, better supplies, luck. Ames never mentioned his walks. He didn't see them as leadership, just habit. But every act of leadership begins somewhere below awareness, in the choices a man repeats until they start to matter. That August, the war ended. The news came through the camp radio, and for the first time, the gate stayed open longer after sunset. Some prisoners sang, others just sat by the fence. Ames did his walk that evening as usual. He could have skipped it. Orders were changing, guards were busy with lists and paperwork, but he put on his cap and went. As he passed the fence, one of the prisoners raised a hand in quiet salute. Ames nodded once, the same as always, and kept walking. By nightfall, the air was cool and still. Floodlights flickered, bugs circled their glow. The sound of boots on gravel marked the space between war and whatever came next. The next morning, the camp woke later than usual. Orders were arriving from headquarters. how to process, how to send the prisoners home. The compound, once filled with marching feet and shouted drills, now sounded like a place exhaling. Ames walked through the yard without his clipboard. Men were shaking hands, some smiling, some unsure what came next. The guard towers still stood, but even the guards looked out at the horizon instead of down. By noon, the sun was high over the Wisconsin pines, turning the gravel paths into silver streaks. Trucks came and went through the front gate. Each time one left, a few prisoners lined the fence, watching silently. The war they'd fought in Europe felt far away, yet the habits of the camp, roll call, cleanup, evening lights, remained. Ames realized then that what they had built here wasn't just confinement. It was a fragile rhythm of coexistence. Later that week, a supply officer arrived to inventory equipment. He found the tool shed spotless, benches sanded smooth, nails sorted by size in small jars. "They cleaned it for you," he said to Ames, half amused. Ames just nodded. He hadn't asked them to. The prisoners had done it themselves, perhaps because they knew he would walk by one last time before they left. That final evening, the sky burned orange behind the watchtowers. The air smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. Some prisoners stood by the fence quietly talking, others smoking or staring toward the guard posts. Ames made his way along the familiar route, boots tracing the same dusted path they always had. But tonight, the air was heavier. The camp loudspeaker crackled with announcements about transport schedules, final inspections, and medical checks. As he approached the southern fence, Ames noticed something unusual. A small group of prisoners standing by the gate, each holding something wrapped in cloth. He slowed, but did not stop. When he drew close, one of them, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward and spoke in careful English. "Lieutenant," he said, "we fix your tool handles." He held out a bundle of sanded wood, smooth as bone. Ames hesitated, then nodded, taking it. "Thank you," he said simply. The man nodded back, and the group stepped aside. It was a brief moment, unnoticed by most, but for the rest of the guards who saw it, something shifted. The prisoner's gesture wasn't about repayment or apology. It was about recognition, one kind of order honoring another. That night, when the lights dimmed across the camp, no one shouted or argued. There was only the hum of the generators and the steady beat of boots fading down the path. The next day, trucks lined up to take the first group out. The morning fog rolled low across the yard, softening the edges of the barracks. Ames stood near the gate as the column moved forward, men carrying small packs, some glancing back toward the fence. The same carpenter, Franz, who had once timed his cleanup by Ames's shadow, was among them. As he passed, he lifted 2 fingers to his cap. Ames returned the gesture. Neither spoke. When the last truck left, the camp was almost silent. Only a few guards remained, taking down signs, folding flags, storing tools. The loudspeaker stood quiet for the first time in months. Ames walked the perimeter one final time. Without the prisoners, the place felt larger, emptier. The fences still caught the light, but there was nothing to divide anymore. He reached the western watchtower, paused, and looked back across the empty compound. That evening, the sunset came earlier. The floodlights flickered on automatically, casting bright halos on the wire. Ames removed his cap, holding it by his side. Somewhere, a train whistle carried across the fields, the sound of departure, distance, and release. He started walking again, slow and measured, as if the men were still there to mark his passing. The gravel crunched the same way it always had. In that sound, faint and steady, lived the trace of something lasting, discipline without cruelty, routine without command, leadership without words. The camp would close within weeks. New assignments would scatter the guards elsewhere, new posts, new duties. But each evening, When the light changed and the air cooled, Ames found himself outside, pacing a short stretch of road behind the barracks, keeping the same rhythm. Old habit, maybe, or a reminder of what order had meant when the world around him was chaos. By the time he left Wisconsin, the fields had gone green again. Grass was already pushing through the gravel paths. Where the fence had stood, the posts leaned slightly, the wire sagging under its own weight. And in the soft wind, the sound it made was almost like footsteps, faint, even, steady. Months passed before Lieutenant Ames heard from anyone connected to Camp McCoy again. By early 1946, he was stationed at a small base in Kansas, training new recruits who had missed the war but would inherit its lessons. He lived in a single-room quarters by the airfield, the kind of place that smelled of oil, coffee, and dust. The world was moving on, cities filling again, factories roaring back to life, headlines turning to elections and rebuilding. Yet sometimes, at dusk, Ames caught himself listening for the hum of floodlights that weren't there. One evening that spring, a letter arrived addressed simply to Lit R. Ames, U.S. Army. Inside was a note written in careful script, signed F. Keller, formerly Camp McCoy. It was from the carpenter. The message was short. Keller wrote that he had returned to Bremen, found his workshop destroyed, and was starting again. "When I sweep the floor," the note said, "I hear your steps on the gravel." Ames folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. He didn't mention it to anyone. The Kansas base was different. No fences, no watchtowers, just wide land and young soldiers trying to learn discipline from a man who had found it through silence. Ames didn't lecture them about leadership. He didn't speak of McCoy. But the pattern of his evenings returned. At the same time each night after the day's drills and paperwork, he walked the edge of the parade ground. The new recruits watched at first out of curiosity. Within weeks, some began to match their own routines to his. One polished boots when Ames passed the barracks. Another shut off the radio at the sound of footsteps outside. No one told them to. They just did. The camp grew quieter in the evenings, more orderly. The commanding officer noticed the change but couldn't explain it. "Whatever you're doing," he told Ames, "keep doing it." By midsummer, word came that Camp McCoy had been dismantled. The barracks were gone, the fences sold for scrap, the land returned to the state. Ames didn't travel to see it, but he imagined the empty field, the ground where he had walked, now marked only by faint tracks leading nowhere. He thought about how easily routines vanish, yet how they leave traces in those who follow them. In July, a group of new officers arrived for training. They asked Ames for advice on managing men. One evening, over coffee in the mess hall, one of them asked directly, "Lieutenant, what's leadership to you?" Ames thought for a moment. Outside, the sun was setting, turning the hangar windows to amber. He finally said, "It's what people expect you to do when you don't have to do it." The others nodded, not fully grasping what he meant, but they remembered the tone. A month later, one of them started walking the field at night, the same way Ames did. Years later, when the war had become something told in newsreels and textbooks, some of the former prisoners wrote to American newspapers about their time in captivity. One letter mentioned a lieutenant at a Wisconsin camp who walked the perimeter each evening, rain or shine. He made no speeches, the writer recalled. He just walked, and we followed rules we no longer feared. The letter was unsigned, buried among hundreds of others. Ames never saw it. But in the quiet legacy of small gestures, his presence lingered. By the early 1950s, Ames had retired from active duty. He settled near Madison, in a modest house facing open fields. He built a small shed behind it and spent his mornings repairing tools, shelves, anything neighbors brought by. Each day ended the same way. He stepped outside as the light dimmed and walked a narrow path between the trees, his boots striking the ground in that steady rhythm. Children in the neighborhood called it the evening march. They didn't know its story, but they felt the calm it carried. In the years that followed, few people spoke of the old POW camps. They faded into history, their fences gone, their lights dark. Yet for those who had seen them, on both sides of the wire, memory lived in quieter forms, the sound of gravel underfoot, the way a man could turn duty into something human simply by keeping time. And so, long after the noise of war had passed, leadership remained not in medals or orders, but in the echo of one man's walk through the fading light. An even pace, a quiet nod, the breath of order held steady against the wind.